Hi everybody, we're back to look at Samuel chapters 4 through 9. And the readings this week begin with the Ark of the Covenant falling captive to the Philistines, and they end with Saul anointed king. It's your basic problem, solution, setup. So when the Ark of the Covenant falls into Philistine hands, you know things have fallen to a whole new low for Israel, the lowest of lows. And there in chapter 4, the priestly family is dead, in addition to being wicked and blind. And the Ark of the Covenant is in the hand of pagans. That's the problem. Now, it's kind of fun to see how God acquits himself well during his Philistine captivity, toppling the gods of the Philistines, demonstrating his dominance over them, especially when they think that they've won. So, to put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple of Dagon, it's kind of like Yahweh's throne is now one of Dagon's trophies, but God shows otherwise. Now, the first step to the solution of this problem is the revival of faith in Yahweh. It's the repentance and fasting of Israel. And that's what we see in the next chapters here, in the next chapters in 1 Samuel. They talk about how addiction recovery begins with hitting rock bottom, and then hopefully people will bounce from there. And here we see Israel hitting bottom and bouncing. You'll remember from a few weeks ago the promise that Moses made in Deuteronomy chapter 5, the promise of restoration. The loss of the ark, the death of the high priest's family was a wake-up call for Israel, and Samuel, serving as a prophet in Israel, was able to make the most of that, leading Israel in an act of repentance. So they're on their way to a better place here. And then serving as judge in Israel, Samuel was then able to unite the tribes, all newly repented, to gather an army and to lead it onto the battlefield. They were able to back the Philistines off, to create a period of security and order. And of course, the Philistines wanted to get rid of this ark as soon as they could. And Samuel was the greatest of the judges. And this is a fitting end for that horrible period of Israel's history. But of course, no man lives forever. And as Samuel ages, his worthless sons start maneuvering to take his place. And the elders of Israel see this happening, and so they ask Samuel for a king. Here in chapter 8, we saw that in our Sunday lectionary last week. In chapter 9, we see how God guides Samuel to this impressive young man named Saul to anoint him as king. Plucked from obscurity, Saul suddenly finds himself being anointed king. The oil is pouring down his head. In chapters to come, we're going to see his feats of leadership and organization as he raises an effective army, a standing army for the first time in Israel, how he successfully takes on the Philistines. He's able to conquer the Philistines and other foes of Israel. So stay tuned for all that. So now let's take a quick look at the Gospel of Luke. Luke 21. It's so grave. Jesus is on the Temple Mount warning of the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus is clearly describing events that would take place in this generation, the generation of his hearers. And what I'd like you to do is to identify, in Jesus' words, each instance where Jesus is describing these events as something that his hearers will themselves witness before and during the Roman siege and the destruction of Jerusalem. I've included 2 links below, right down there, to short videos that tell this story, provide some context for this. The first video covers the Jewish war, which gives context to what Jesus has said about wars and rumors of wars and portents over the whole world, right? And then the second video offers a much more detailed description of the horrific 5-month-long siege of Jerusalem. And it also gives a much better graphic representation of how that battle proceeded. So what you can do is start with the first half of that first video. Once it gets to Jerusalem, you go to the second video and watch that in detail. And because of Jesus' warning, his followers were able to flee before the siege. And that really is the marking out time when Judaism, as we know it today, and Christianity, as we know it today, became separate. Because during that first century, Judaism and Christianity were in the same cradle, and Christianity was simply those Jews who followed Jesus and opened the door to Gentiles. And after the destruction of Jerusalem, those two never walk again together. It's very sad. So as you read Jesus in this week of his passion, you see the gravity, the weight of this impending doom on Jerusalem. Read this as a precursor to his crucifixion, and read it awaiting the joy of the resurrection. That's our lesson for this week, and I'll see you on Sunday.